Hey everyone, this is a piece from the new book, Key Concepts, Marx Key Concepts, um, by edited by um, sorry, edited by Riccardo Bellofiore and Tommaso Redolfi Riva. I have a piece by Riccardo Bellofiore. I have multiple pieces by him, but I have a piece by Bellofiore and Tommaso Redolfi Riva from uh, that's titled it's something like Neue Marx Lectura, the new reading of Marx, putting the critique of political economy back into the critique of society, or something like that. But you should check that out. It's very informative. But I was super stoked to find out that this book came out, and I've been reading pieces from it, and I think they're very um, thus far what I've read, they're very I think rich and but also fairly easy to follow. So if you're looking for an introduction to some uh, uh, Marxist concepts, especially when it comes to the critique of political economy, I definitely recommend checking this book out. And basically anything that Bellafiore has written, it's a very important thinker. Um, I don't know if he actually has any books, but he's edited mad volumes of stuff. So hopefully one day he gets either a book of collections of his writings, or he writes his own book. Um, Maybe he has already written his own book that's just like a full, I don't know, monograph, but I don't think he does. Anyway, the title of the piece is Absolute Value. Um, so here it goes. Absolute Value by Riccardo Bellofiore. Quote, Marx's abstraction is not, this quote's from Rosa Luxemburg. Quote, Marx's abstraction is not an invention but a discovery. Marx's abstraction does not exist in Marx's head, but in the commodity economy. Marx's abstraction has not an imaginary existence, but a real social existence, so real that Marx's abstraction can be cut, hammered, weighed, and coined. The abstract human labor discovered by Marx is, in its developed form, none other than money. End quote. Rosa Luxemburg, 1900. Section 1, Introduction. Looking for the meaning of, quote, essay, end quote, in a dictionary, one finds a suggestion, something like, quote, initial and tentative effort on a particular topic dealt from a personal point of view, end quote. This is what this chapter is. Footnote. This chapter is part of a much larger manuscript. What is it? Intrinsic value, absolute value, and exploitation, where I consider Marx's trajectory in his investigation of absolute value. In that manuscript, there is not only a more detailed interpretation of the text on absolute value in the entire of Marx's oeuvre, but that there had to be, but here that here had to be brutally abridged, but also a more substantial review of the secondary literature. End footnote. Though the subject, the relationship between value, money, and labor in Marx, has been discussed countless times, and though I have extensively written about it, I deal with it only from a limited and even idiosyncratic angle here. I investigate how Marx connected the notion of, quote, absolute value, end quote, with the question, what is it? What is it that makes labor the unity which is exhibited in money through, quote, value, end quote, as the universal power of exchangeability? The main text that I am considering is Marx's critique of Bailey in the economic manuscript of 1861 to 63, in the part initially published as theories of surplus value. I have a piece up by Christopher J. Author, who's written in a lot of the same books as Riccardo Bellofiore. That's a review of Enrique Dussels' book, introduced by another co-author of Riccardo Bellofiore, Fred Mosley. It's a review. It's a Chris or CJ Author's review of Enrique Dussels' Towards an Unknown Marx, which is a book about the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, which, if you didn't know, was where the material that constituted theories of surplus value, as they were published by Karl Kautsky, come from. There's a footnote here. Even though I've quoted from Mega 2, the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, which is like the collection of all of Marx and Engels' writings in their original languages, where the manuscripts are in 6 volumes, I refer to the text to the Theories of Surplus Value 2, Theories of Surplus Value 2, or Theories of Surplus Value 3, according to the pages I am quoting in the English translation, to help readers locate the argument. End footnote. Mine is a chapter written in English and hence mainly devoted to those who read Marx in this language without at the same time having access to the original. This is a severe disadvantage to the understanding of the argument and a liability in the debate. As I have argued at length elsewhere, I am convinced that almost all the translations of Marx in English need to be revised. This problem, however, is more intensely acute in the only translation of theories of surplus value that we have, or at least that I know of. The same cannot be said about translations in other languages. My perspective in what follows is that Marx's, neither Ricardo's nor Bailey's, notion of absolute value is the crucial theoretical intermediate link leading from intrinsic value to capital as value in process. Mine is partially also a self-criticism, since, in the past, I wrongly identified, quote, intrinsic, end quote, with, quote, absolute, end quote, value, as most literature, both supportive or critical, does. I now think this identification is wrong and dangerous. My work on Sraffa and Marx alerted me to this. But, in fact, the elements to reach my conclusions in this chapter on the distinction between intrinsic and absolute value were already there in my past work. Moreover, my perpetual journey of reading, interpreting, and reconstructing Marx, 3 very different endeavors, by the way, has been instrumental in allowing me to come to decipher these pages of theories of surplus value. Marx's pages on Bailey, on the background of what he argued in the Grundrisse and Contribution, are the preamble to understand the dialectical derivation of the form of value that Capital, the book, in its various drafts, tried to pursue from 1867 onwards, never reaching a definitive formulation that satisfied him. Another way to characterize this chapter is an exercise in, quote, plagiarism, end quote. In exposing Marx's statements, I stick to a close English rendition of his mostly German theories of surplus value text, alternative to the one available in English. Quote, mostly, end quote, German, because Marx also partially writes directly in English. Interestingly enough, even in this case, the English translation, quote, corrects, end quote, his English without notice. It is not plagiarism narrowly defined, for 3 reasons. First, I depart systematically from the available English translation, and it would be impossible to specify my alterations continuously, though I will do that parsimoniously. Second, I freely interpolate changes where I think different formulations can sensibly portray more mature positions by Marx which are, however, already implicit in theories of surplus value. For example, I make explicit the distinction between, quote, value and, quote, exchange value, sometimes evidencing it in brackets, even crossing out exchange value, the exchange part of the word. On the page it says, quote, parenthesis, exchange and parenthesis value with the exchange part crossed out, when I think value is an issue. Third, I elaborate on Marx's argument for clarification. Finally, when I believe that the indication of the German term behind my English translation could help the reader get a more profound comprehension, I do not refrain from adding the relevant word in brackets. The structure of the chapter is as follows. In section 5.2, I summarize Marx's argument about absolute value in his critique of Bailey in theories of surplus value. In section 5.3, I provide some hints to how Marx's argument looks before and after theories of surplus value. In section 5.4, I maintain that, quote, exploitation, end quote, in my understanding of the notion, is the proper answer to what is the unity, allowing us to speak of a value theory of labor, thus suggesting an alternative way to ground the value theory of labor. A short conclusion follows. In Appendix 1, I give the conventions that I use to translate some of the more relevant and controversial expressions in Marx's text, though some key terms are discussed as the chapter unfolds. Finally, in Appendix 2, I give a short survey of the secondary literature. The, quote, interpretation, end quote, of Marx, which I present here, unveils the richness but also the blind alleys of Marx's various attempts to answer the critical question he posed, what is it? At the same time, it provides many elements useful to the, quote, reconstruction of Marx's critique of the political economy, along the lines I have undertaken elsewhere, which is essential for the reader to understand my conclusions fully. Section 2, quote, what is it, end quote. Marx on Bailey in the 1861-63 economic manuscript. Marx deals with Bailey first in the theories of surplus value 2, discussing how Riccardo grasped, quote, absolute and, quote, relative value without a proper understanding of the, quote, form of value, end quote. Bailey's criticism of Ricardo's confusion about the determination, Bestimung, of, quote, value, end quote, is also essential for our understanding. Riccardo begins from relative values, or, quote, exchangeable values, end quote, behind the equivalence among commodities. There must be equality in, quote, substance, end quote, labor. Because of that, they are, quote, values, end quote, which are only different in, quote, magnitude, end quote, according to the amount they, quote, contain, end quote. This is the Riccardo with whom Marx establishes a critical relation of continuity. Riccardo, however, does not analyze the character of this, quote, labor, end quote. Riccardo does not look at the, quote, shape, end quote, gestalt, taken by labor, that is, the particular determination of it as it creates value, and as it is exhibited, darstellt, in, quote, exchange value, end quote. Misunderstanding the, quote, character, end quote, of this labor, he cannot figure out the internal connection between labor and money, that is, on the one hand, the determination of value through labor time, and on the other hand, how commodities necessarily progress into the, quote, formation, end quote, of money. These two limits account for his erroneous theory of money. The immediate exclusive interest in the magnitude of value induces Riccardo to disregard all the mediations. For Riccardo, quote, value in exchange, end quote, is first specified as the relative power of purchasing other goods, as in Bailey, it corresponds to how value is manifested phenomenally, erscheint, in circulation. However, this definition is soon overcome by, quote, comparative value, end quote, exchangeable value, end quote, of commodities depends on the labor time relatively bestowed in producing them. Relative value may remain the same if the, quote, absolute, end quote, difficulty of producing commodities assessed in their separate productive processes changes proportionally. Marx also attributes to Riccardo a definition of, quote, absolute value, end quote, according to which this is a specific kind of comparative or relative value. The relative or comparative value, thus conceived as the real exhibition, realen Darstellung, of the exchange value of one commodity and the use value of another, or in money, as if unmasking the comparative determination by labor, is labeled by Riccardo as absolute value. Note that Riccardo's absolute value, as long as Riccardo's absolute value offers to our view the comparative changes in labor time, is nevertheless a relative concept, which is also named by Riccardo as, quote, real value, or value, quote, as such, end quote. Schlechten. In this discourse, Bailey only finds, quote, contradictions, end quote, and raises objections because Riccardo regards value not as a relation between objects, but as a, quote, positive, end quote, result produced by a definite quantity of labor. In this sense, Riccardo would see value as something both intrinsic and absolute. In other words, Bailey ascribes to Riccardo the same identification of intrinsic value with absolute value, too often attributed to Marx as a characteristic pertaining to the single commodity, independently from commodity exchange and arising from production in isolation. This is a side note in Michael Heinrich's introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital. He refers to value as something akin, as a feature, is something that is a relational concept, and as opposed to, like, if you think of, like, say 2 fire trucks that are red, they're both red in independence, right? You don't need to have one truck over here is red, and if one fire truck over here is red. But the way value works, it's as if the fire trucks were only red when brought together. Which seems like kind of relevant to this concept of, when he says that the absolute value too often attributed to Marx is definitely this kind of like substantialist, is what Heinrich uses as the word for this, like viewing value as inherent to a single commodity, as if commodity production and commodity exchange were not historically specific social relations. Anyway, back to the text. This complaint is not without reason because of Riccardo's faulty exposition. Due to Riccardo's neglect of the investigation into the determinate form taken by labor as abstract universal, abstract elegeimenon, and social, and the fact that Riccardo only gives attention to the magnitude of value. However, what Bailey does not see is precisely that the relativity of the concept of value is in no way eliminated because all commodities as values are looked at by Riccardo as proportional, quote, expressions, end quote, Ausdrücke of social labor time. Indeed, the relativity in question is not merely about the ratio of the exchange of each commodity with one another. Instead, it refers to the relation between all of them and the social labor as their substance. In fact, Marx attributes Riccardo aspects of his position and, of course, comments that this is correct. Riccardo must be criticized for quite the opposite reason, because Riccardo almost always conceives only, quote, relative or, quote, comparative values, even though as ratios of distinct labor amounts, and forgets, quote, absolute value, end quote. In Theories of Surplus Value 3, with very few exceptions, Marx uses the term, quote, unity, end quote, Einheit, instead of, quote, substance, end quote, and he goes deeper in his understanding of, quote, absolute value, end quote, as opposed to Riccardo's. Before illustrating this, I have to refer to the Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2, pages, where Marx advances a first opinion on Riccardo's search for an invariable standard of value. Marx's first take on this issue is quite dismissive. He writes that Section 6, on an invariable measure of value, deals with the measure of value without giving any significant contribution. The connection between value's, quote, immanent, end quote, measure, through Durch, labor time, and the necessity of a, quote, external, end quote, measure of commodity values is not understood, nor is it even raised as a question. A perfect measure of value, that is, a standard assessing the absolute, unchanging in time, difficulty of production of commodities in terms of labor time, could be a, quote, divining rod, end quote, to assess in which commodity A, sorry, I think there's a typo here. It says, could be a, quote, divining rod, end quote, to assess in which commodity A change in relative price originates. I don't know. Unfortunately, due to the unequal time structure of production, that is not enough to construct an invariable measure of value. Assuming a uniform rate of profit and unchanged labor content, wage variations determine modifications of the relative prices of commodities. Riccardo recognizes that a measure of value of this kind is, quote, perfect, end quote, only for the commodities produced with precisely the same production conditions. For Marx, Riccardo's is not an adequate discussion, and in no way does it allow the construction of an invariable money medium. Let us move then to Marx's discussion of Bailey on Riccardo in Theories of Surplus Value 3. Here, Marx evaluates the limits and merits of Bailey's main point of attack against Riccardo's whole system. The indictment is of having transformed value, which is always relative, into something, quote, absolute, end quote. In Marx's view, The problem stems from the failure to distinguish the different and successive moments of, quote, value. The value must be grasped as a processual concept in movement, which cannot be frozen in any of its determinations. Marx sets apart the inquiry about the quantitative relation between commodities in circulation from the, quote, display, end quote, Darstellung of value itself. The existence of the intrinsic value of commodities cannot be shown by the commodity's particular use value. The existence of the intrinsic value of commodities must appear in the commodity's expression in other use values. The value must appear of commodities must appear in their expression in other use values. That is, in the relation in which these other use values exchange for those commodities. This is clarified by Marx himself in English. I have reinstated here his original, discarding the, quote, corrections, end quote, by the translator, which are recorded in square brackets. Quote, if we speak of the value in exchange for a thing, we mean the relative quantities of all other commodity that can be exchanged with the first commodity. I guess it's every other commodity or all commodities that can be exchanged for the first commodity. But on further consideration, we shall find that for the proportion in which one thing exchanges with an infinite mass of other things which have nothing at all in common with it, all those various heterogeneous things must be considered as proportionate representations, expressions of the same common unity, of an element quite different from their natural existence or appearances. We shall then furthermore find that if our meaning has any sense, the value of a commodity is something by which it not only differs from or is related to other commodities, but is a quality by which it differs from its own existence as a thing, as a value in use. End quote. Marx's argument against Bailey here is that what is, quote, absolute, end quote, that is independent, is use value. Value is instead posited by living labor in a certain relation to socially necessary equal labor time. Value, therefore, is eminently relative, so much so that its magnitude varies if the labor time to reproduce that commodity is altered compared to what was required for its own production. Marx then defines Bailey as a fetishist, since he attributes the social, quote, power of exchangeability, end quote, to things as natural objects, even though Bailey does that referring not to the individual commodity, but to all of the commodities in concert, so to speak. Quote, I mentioned that it is characteristic of labor based on the private exchange that the social character of labor is exhibited, darstellt, in an upside-down way, verkehrt, as the property of things, dinge, that a social relation is manifested phenomenally, erscheint, as a relation between things, between products, values in use, commodities. This form of manifestation, Erscheinung, is accepted as something effective, etwas Wirkliches, by our fetish worshipper, and he, in fact, believes that their properties determine the exchange value of things as things, and is altogether a natural property of things. End quote. Marx too stresses the relation not between things, like Bailey, not of the commodities exchanged against a supposedly invariable standard, like Riccardo, rather as exhibitions of portions of social labor in commodity circulation. In this relation, things are not independent, selbstständiges, and hence, quote, autonomous, end quote, entities. Things are instead outer expressions of the way social production is internally organized. This requires investigating the movement of value from the inner to the outer, in concert with the one about the exhibition of value in the co-determination of commodity production and commodity circulation. In fact, for Marx, the two perspectives, though distinct, refer to the same conceptual determination of what value is. The claim that value, being relative, is not to be devised as an entity does not dispense altogether with the concept of, quote, absolute value, end quote. Quite the opposite. The claim that value, being relative, is not devised by an entity, is not devised as an entity, opens the way to the proper construction of this notion of absolute value in Marx, in a formulation coherent with Marx's articulation of the couple fetish character / fetishism. This latter distinction is crucial for Marx's strategy of showing that Darstellung, exhibition of value, is at the same time an Offenbarung, revelation of the human practice embedded in value itself. Footnote: the term, with theological overtones, is about an identity revealing at the end of exposition, an identity between form and content, and between external and internal. End footnote. I want to reread that last sentence. This latter distinction is crucial for Marx's strategy of showing that the Darstellung, exhibition of value, is, at the same time, an Offenbarung, revelation of the human practice embedded in value itself. Marx makes the case that in exchange, commodities must impart to their value a separate or autonomous selbstständigen, quote, being there, end quote, which is different from and independent of verschieden und unabhängig, the body of their own use values. Commodity circulation must evolve into the formation, Bildung, of money. How does money, quote, grow out of, end quote, commodities? First of all, through the, quote, imagined, end quote, anticipation in price. This is, properly speaking, a Vorstellung, a, quote, representation, end quote. Commodities to be exchanged are ex ante, notionally, quote, materialized, end quote, in the body of money against which they are sold. Footnote. It anticipates in thought a maturiatur. See Appendix 1. The fuck? End footnote. Commodities are now all one in the same identical, quote, form, end quote, of labor. As such, they are discrete amounts of a unitary substance. Marx emphasizes that the Einheit, the unity, is anterior to the actual commodity exchange on the market. Marx's claim that commodities are already presupposed to be equal in a, quote, third, end quote, even before final circulation, so that they are just different amounts of an identical unity, does not refer to some objectified value, either a produced commodity or an invariable measure of value. Marx's perspective is detailed in this dense quote. Quote, the labor which constitutes the unity, Einheit, of value is not only homogeneous, simple average labor. The labor which constitutes the unity of value is the labor of a private individual exhibited in a determinate product. But as value, the product must be the embodiment of social labor. Verkörperung der gesellschaftlichen Arbeit, and as such, be immediately convertible from one use value into another. Into any other. The determinate use value in which labor is immediately exhibited so that it can be converted from one form into another is irrelevant. Thus, the private labor has to be immediately exhibited as the private labor's opposite, social labor. The labor thus transformed as its immediate opposite is abstract universal labor, which is therefore exhibited in a universal equivalent. Only through this alienation/externalization, Verauserung, individual labor is exhibited as individual labor's opposite. The commodity, however, must have this universal expression before the commodity is alienated/externalized. This necessity to exhibit individual labor as universal labor is equivalent to the necessity of exhibiting a commodity as money. Footnote. The reader is alerted that when I refer to this notion by Marx, I use the expression, quote, money as a commodity, end quote, to express that in Marx, money is an excluded commodity unlike any other commodity, distinguishing money from the Ricardian and neoclassical theories, where money is a commodity like any other. End footnote. Back to Marx's quote. The commodity receives this exhibition insofar as money serves as a measure of value, and money is an expression of value of the commodity in the commodity's price. It is only through sale, i.e., the commodity's actual metamorphosis into money, that the commodity acquires the commodity's adequate expression as exchange value. The first transformation is just a theoretical process. The second is an actual process, end quote. Footnote. According to the argument of this chapter, the point Marx is making is that the intrinsic value of the commodity is eventually expressed in, quote, absolute value, end quote, as exchange value. If this fails, the product is not a commodity, but just a use value. Back to the text. In the context I am discussing, Marx is playing on an alternative meaning of Veräußerung, which is, quote, divestment, end quote, and, quote, undressing, end quote, and externalization. Footnote. See Arthur 1986. Arthur 1986 is useful about the translation of Veräußerung. End footnote. More specifically, it refers to a kind of disembodiment of the ghostly objectivity of value from the individual internal objectification of labor within the commodity. Value as the, quote, soul, end quote, of that commodity is released, and it seizes the use value of money as its own external, quote, body, end quote. It is precisely a, quote, possession, end quote, like in a Gothic novel, the coming into being of the ghost of value in the body of money as a commodity. That is why, quote, money as money, end quote, is defined by Marx as value embodied. It is a fetish, or better, the fetish, capital F, truly socially endowed with social powers. However, these social powers are mistakenly assumed to belong to things as if by nature, which is a fetishist illusion. The labor of individuals is exhibited in the universal equivalent as its opposite. It is a social, abstract, and universal labor displayed through a process involving reification and thingification. Footnote. For the difference between, quote, reification and, quote, thingification related to the differences between Sache and Ding, see Appendix 1 and see Tarraco, 2017. End footnote. Okay, I think it's a break time. Yeah, it's break time. Even though it is only through a sale that the commodity eventually becomes, quote, exchange value, end quote, the commodity develops a universal expression of value being sold. This occurs through money as a measure of value in its price. It is a Verwandlung, a metamorphosis, a change of shape, as if by supernatural means. The commodity, as intrinsic value, must be converted into money, which is the immediately social, quote, embodiment in the universal equivalent of abstractly universal social labor. As such, all commodities have an identical form, possess the same shape, and manifest themselves phenomenally as the immediate incarnation of social labor. As soon as it is sold, the commodity is transfigured into money. Then, value, thanks precisely to this dual movement of externalization from the commodity and possession, its embodiment in gold as money now holds an autonomous existence separate from its use value. It now is absolute value. In money as absolute value, the quote being there end quote of value as a given amount of social labor time is achieved. Marx insists that in this quote absolute end quote exchangeability that the commodity possesses as money, in its quote absolute end quote efficiency as valeur d'exchange, exchange value, which he stresses has nothing to do with the magnitude of value. No quantitative determination is shown, only qualitative identity. The processual development of the commodity makes its value self-sufficient and really exhibits its value in quote free shape end quote as an outer quote exchange value end quote alongside the quote use value end quote, in which value is embedded, and this is already ideally anticipated in its price parenthesis tag end parenthesis. This conclusion is valid only because money is a commodity, though an excluded commodity. As such, money can be exchanged immediately against any other commodity. While Bailey chastises quote absolute value end quote as a scholastic invention of Riccardo, which denies the relationality of value and thinks that it has to be categorically rejected, Marx goes in the opposite direction and radicalizes the notion in ways forbidden to Riccardo. Quote, absolute value, for Marx, is the effective separation of the intrinsic values, which, to begin with, are cut away from the commodities bearing those values, and afterwards are embodied in the exterior use value of money as a commodity. Absolute, quote, value, end quote, is then nothing but the independent exhibition of intrinsic value through money as a real abstraction. Footnote. The point was clear to Luxemburg in 1900, as the epigraph of this chapter confirms, end footnote. In Riccardo, it is very different. Absolute value refers to the, quote, comparative value, end quote, between each and every commodity and the standard, while the latter is conceived as the invariable measure of value. Marx insists instead on the claim that the variability of the standard cannot be avoided. Though it may be thought of as an, quote, imperfection, end quote, of the standard, its variability necessarily arises from the fact that the intrinsic value of the commodity needs to be expressed relatively in an exhibition which posits the commodity to be sold as, quote, equal to money as another commodity. It is as commodities that they share the same unity and are thus qualitatively identical. Being a commodity, though a very special, quote, excluded, end quote, commodity, money must, by definition, be of a changeable value. This qualitative aspect is crucial and fundamental. Hence, Marx's version of the labor theory of value does not have room for an invariable standard of value. In his Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3, comments on Bailey and Riccardo, it is already clear that Marx's conceptualization of, quote, autonomous value, end quote, becomes even sharper when it progresses from the notion of money to that of value in process, namely capital. Quote, capital, end quote, as the relation between value as the presupposition vorausgesetzten Wert of the process of production, and value as resulting, or posited, is the over-grasping / dominating capital S subject determining the entire capitalist production process. Footnote. Maybe this is one of the occasions in which the English translation can be commended, even though Darstellung is translated as, quote, expression, and Processirenden as, quote, dynamic, end quote, both questionable choices. On the contrary, quote, all-embracing and decisive, end quote, is close enough to the idea of what Marx means for capital as the subject. All this reappears conspicuously at the beginning of chapter 4 of Capital 1. End footnote. The condition for value as capital to reproduce itself and increase in a spiral as value in process is to measure its own growth in a common monetary standard, notwithstanding the changes in the multifarious physical components which serve as the bodies. And that, Marx argues against Bailey, exactly requires that relative value is converted into value as an absolute. Suppose my interpretation is not too far off the mark. In that case, it follows that it would be spectacularly wrong to argue that Marx withheld altogether from a concept of absolute value because value is relative, although this may seem counterintuitive. As a matter of fact, Marx writes, quote, if commodities exchange themselves in the relation in which commodities exhibit the same amount of labor time, then those commodities being there as objectified labor time, their being there as embodied labor time, is their unity, their identical element, end quote. Marx, theories of surplus value. The indication about the embodiment through labor time means that the identity of commodities as bearers of value is expressed when the abstract labor time objectified in the commodities is already mirrored in the concrete labor time embodied in money as absolute value. Footnote. As I have shown elsewhere, e.g. Bellofiore 2014, abstract labor is, quote, contained from Enthalten, while concrete labor is, quote, embodied, end quote. See also Appendix 1. This is particularly relevant to understand the dialectical derivation of the form of value. End footnote. They exhibit an identical quality, but this, Marx insists, gives no immediate quantitative determination. The relativity of value may be understood in opposite alternative ways. Like in Bailey, the relativity of value can be conceived as the ratio of exchange between the use values of the commodities traded. Marx instead portrays the relativity of value as the quantitative proportion among the commodities' absolute values as relative shares of a common, quote, third, end quote, something. In this case, Marx argues directly in English that it is not the rate at which two commodities exchange that determines their value, as Bailey thinks, but rather the other way around. Their value determines the rate at which those commodities exchange. For value, Marx means here the, quote, absolute, end quote, value. That is, their, quote, intrinsic, end quote, value. If and when expressed and exhibited in money as exchange value. The, quote, immanent measure, end quote, of commodities is what expresses in circulation as an inner-outer movement from production the unity between commodity and money, since they are both objectifications of living labor in production. Marx writes once again in English, quote, the absolute expression of its relative value would be its expression in time of labor. And by this absolute expression, it would be expressed as something relative, but in the absolute relation by which it is value, end quote. It is a crucial passage. The internal connection of an individual commodity with the others in terms of labor time must be determined as an absolute expression of relative value, since in this way the relativity between the commodities does reveal them as portions of the social totality of dissociated labor. On the one hand, one is here reminded of Saint Bonaventura. Omne respectivum fundatur super aliquo absoluto. That is, everything relative, respectivus and relativus are equivalent, is founded on something absolute. One second. Bonaventura, or Giovanni, was an Italian Catholic Franciscan bishop, cardinal, scholastic theologian, and philosopher who lived from 1221 to 1274. The seventh minister general of the order of Friars Minor. Bonaventura also served for a time as Bishop of Albano. Bonaventura was canonized on the 14th of April 1482 by Pope Sixtus IV and declared a doctor of the Church in 1588 by Pope Sixtus V, becoming known as the, quote, seraphic doctor, end quote. His feast day is 15th of July. Many writings from the Middle Ages once attributed to him have been subsequently reclassified under the name Pseudo-Bonaventura. I don't know. Yeah, it says in a footnote here, as quoted in Dawes, 1996, Bonaventure was a from Bagnoregio, was a Franciscan living from 1217 to 1274. Footnote. On the other hand, the references to Kant in bourgeois society as ungesellige Geselligkeit, quote, unsocial sociability. The social relations among human beings are detached from themselves, reified in a thing, and turned into a fetish. I just looked up unsocial sociability. I don't know, the first thing that comes up that says the cunning of nature involves a feature of human social interaction which Kant calls, quote, unsociable sociability, end quote, which Kant defines as the human, quote, tendency to enter into society, a tendency connected, however, with a constant resistance that continually threatens to break up this society, end quote, Kant. Back to the text. Footnote. The Kantian concept of unsocial sociability that characterizes bourgeois society and capital is crucial in Lucio Coletti. See Coletti 1969 for a long quote from the fourth and fifth theses of the idea of a universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, written by Kant or published by Kant in 1784. End footnote. It is exactly in this, quote, absolute, end quote, relation that the commodity is value, not just a product or use value. Absolute does not mean, quote, non-relative, but, quote, made separate from, end quote, detached, end quote. As André Dawes observes, quote, the word absolutus itself says a relation, end quote. Sorry, I was looking up Andre Dawes if there's anything. I can't see anything. As Andre Dawes observes, quote, the word absolutus itself says a relation, end quote. For Marx, the adjective, quote, absolute, end quote, refers to the two following entwined circumstances. First, the commodity, beyond being use value, is, quote, value, end quote. But the commodity is value only as long as the commodity materializes as, quote, exchange value, end quote, in another commodity. In this way, the value within the commodity is separated or, quote, abstracted, end quote, from the use value of that commodity itself and enters into a relation where money becomes an embodied value, the, quote, body of value, end quote, as Marx writes in Capital, Volume 1. Second, and in the same movement, this same peculiar kind of sociality between the isolated producers is separated or abstracted from the isolated producers and controls the isolated producers. Quote, absolute, end quote, refers not only to this, quote, detachment, end quote, but also to the consequent, quote, despotic command, end quote. The abstracted moment, here the, quote, form, end quote, of money as absolute value, is considered in the relativity with the correlativity from which the process of isolation and separation begins. Here, the form of the commodity, inseparable from its own use value, quote, absolute, end quote, refers to developing value into an over-grasping and self-reproducing totality. Marx, who in Theories of Surplus Value 2 was so critical about the search by Riccardo for a, quote, invariable standard of value, end quote, has now something favorable to say about it. He writes that Riccardo often sounds, and sometimes actually speaks, as if the, quote, quantity of labor, end quote, were a solution to the false or misplaced problem of a, quote, unvariable measure of values, end quote. The, quote, this, quote, false semblance, end quote, Falsschein, stems from the fact that, as Marx already suggested, Riccardo did not grasp that the single labor must exhibit itself as abstract universal labor, and in this form, as a specific kind of social labor. Footnote. Note how the adjective, quote, false, end quote, reinforces the noun, quote, semblance, end quote, resulting in something like a, quote, deceiving pretense, end quote. Marx's intent is to proclaim that the quantitative determination of labor has nothing to do with, quote, measuring, end quote, value against an unchanging benchmark. End footnote. To understand how this Darstellung becomes possible, Riccardo should have figured out how the formation of money is connected with the essence of value and with value's determination through labor time. And this, in my interpretation, is exactly what is implied by absolute value as embodied value. Bailey's objection has the merit of dispelling the confusion between money as the outer, quote, measure, end quote, exhibiting value, with money being a commodity mirroring other commodities, and the immanent measure of the substance of value. Nevertheless, Samuel Bailey fails to recognize in money the conversion or transfiguration of value. Marx will rephrase the same concept in Capital Volume 1, arguing that this transformation is transubstantiation. The sensible body of gold as money is changed over into the embodiment of the suprasensible soul of the commodity, externalized and incarnated in the excluded commodity. The conclusion in Theories of Surplus Value 3 is that Bailey stops at the mere superficial consideration of the measure of value, this latter, being an external one, already presupposes value. Marx's point is that Riccardo never asked the proper question. The fact of being posited as equal means that there should be something in common between the commodities exchanged. Quote, the unity of the two commodities A and B is at the first view their exchangeability, their, quote, exchangeable, end quote, objects. As, quote, exchangeable, end quote, objects, commodities A and B are magnitudes of the same denomination. But this, quote, their, end quote, existence as an, quote, exchangeable, end quote, object must be different from their existence as values in use. What is it, end quote? Marx. Footnote. Marx is here writing directly in English. I put the interrogation, quote, what is it, end quote, in italic for emphasis. It is the key question of this chapter, and in fact the primary and ultimate subject matter involved in Marx's monetary value theory of labor, distinguishing it from any other value theory. End footnote. Value is the, quote, power of purchasing, end quote. Yet purchasing presupposes not only value, but money itself. Therefore, presenting the issue in this way implies that the externalization of value into money is aborted or inverted. Yes, value is a relation. Nevertheless, Marx thinks that in the commodity, unquestionably, something intrinsic and positive is acting as a, quote, power, end quote, in exchange. Quote, value, end quote, must be found before expressing value. This power is not to be found in the use value dimension, in the object's particularity. Marx compares commodities in the value dimension to point in the space dimension. Supposing that both commodities which are exchanged are contained in this value dimension, quote, if we speak of the distance as a relation between two things, we suppose something, quote, intrinsic, some, quote, property of the things themselves, which enables the things to be distant from each other. ... We speak of their difference in space. Thus we suppose both of them to be contained in the space, to be points of the space. Thus we equalize them as being both instances of the space, and only after, having them equalized sub specie spati, we distinguish them as different points of space. To belong to space is their unity, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx is again writing directly in English. End footnote. The unity which Marx is speaking about cannot be traced back to, quote, utility, end quote, neither to some relation that commodities entertain with each other as natural things, nor as some relation which commodities have as natural things to human needs. It is not the degree of the commodity's utility that determines the quantities in which they exchange. Footnote. Here Marx is too quick in rejecting a subjective utility theory of value. I agree with Napoleoni, 1976. My translation from the Italian original. Quote, Marx, in the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, Marx arrives at determining value as objectified labor through a process that can give the impression of successive elimination of various characteristics of commodities, so that, in the end, there remains, as a residue, the fact, precisely, that they are products of labor. If this were indeed the case, it would certainly be right, the traditional objection according to which one cannot see why one should choose labor rather than, for example, utility. If they are all products of labor, commodities are also all useful. Marx's problem is not one of identifying a note that all commodities have in common, and then abstracting it from all the others. It is instead of identifying what the commodity is in a historically determined social function. End footnote. End quote, end footnote. That was Claudio Napoleoni. Claudio Napoleoni. Okay, back to the text, or end footnote. Excuse me. I interpret Marx as arguing that, like distance, value is a relation, but at the same time, value is something distinct from that relation, and the, quote, absolute, end quote, ground of that relation. If exchange value as the expression of a commodity's value requires another commodity, both commodities must be part of that common space. Then, once more, the question, why is this, quote, unity, end quote, their, quote, identity, end quote, that something by which they become exchangeable in a certain amount? Marx thinks that within the commodity, a value, quote, in itself, end quote, can be discovered only in relation to, quote, social labor, end quote, considered as, quote, another thing, end quote. As long as commodities are produced not as objects of direct consumption, but as bearers of value, commodities are a kind of, quote, check, end quote, on a given quantity of all the exhibitions of social labor, and they are all forced to give themselves, as values, a form of existence distinct from their existence as use values. The formation of money is brought about as the development of the labor contained in commodities as tentatively social labor, the inner-outer movement, the movement of, quote, expression, end quote. Marx is transparent that for him it is the development of their value, which necessarily brings with it the formation of money, the independent form of, quote, being there, end quote, of value as exchange value. Footnote. Marx, 1861 to 63, end footnote. Bailey is right that money, as an extrinsic measure of value, is perfectly adequate to the task. The problem of the, quote, invariable measure of value, end quote, disappears, since money, as the exclusive third, must be a variable price. But Bailey erroneously infers from this that the inquiry about the concept of value and the problem of value's determination are meaningless. For Bailey, value is the same as any arbitrary relative price, and there is no difference between the price of a commodity expressed in money or in whatever other commodity. But all these myriads of relative prices are just particular expressions of the same value, while money price is the universal expression of it. In other words, Bailey is right in saying that money need not be a commodity of invariable value. But Bailey wrongly concludes that no independent determination of value, distinct from the commodity itself, is necessary. Riccardo's vain quest for the, quote, invariable measure of values, end quote, concealed the search for the concept of value itself, and Bailey's attack against Riccardo is based on an untenable identification between determination and measure of value. The value of commodities is a result, and the value of commodities is inherently, quote, changeable, end quote. Abstract labor is the activity constituting value and is not a commodity. Abstract labor is instead a fluid which is objectified in variable amounts. The closing stage of Marx's arguments, wrapping up his perspective vis-a-vis Bailey and Riccardo, can be once again paraphrased following his own statement in English very closely. First, the inquiry must, quote, find the value before expressing the value, finding in what way the values in use, so different from each other, fall under the common category and denomination of values, so that the value of the one may be expressed in the other. Moreover, if the values of different commodities are expressed in the same third commodity, however variable that third commodity's value may be, it is of course very easy to compare these expressions already possessed of a common denomination, end quote. Marx. The difficulty consists in equalizing a commodity with any portion of another, and, quote, this is only possible if a common unity exists for them, because those commodities are different representations of the same unity. If all commodities are to be expressed in gold, as money, the difficulty remains the same. There must be a common unity between gold and each of the other commodities. They are equivalents. They are both equal expressions of values, only different or equal in quantity, but always quantities of the same quality. The difficulty is to find this quality. End quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx uses, quote, to represent, end quote, for his own Darstellen. This gives pause for thought for those who, like me, are very insistent on the need to find the proper English rendition of Marx's German terminology. End footnote. Back to the text. After this quality is unearthed, and the value of commodities is given as the commodity's common unity, measuring or expressing the commodity's relative value becomes the same thing, as Bailey maintains. But, contrary to Bailey's views, estimating value is not expressing value. And one does not arrive at, quote, expression, end quote, until one arrives at a unit distinct from the immediate being there, or Dasein, of commodities. The theoretical perspective is unambiguous. The reference to, quote, quantity of labor, end quote, is sensible in the genetical inquiry about the nature of value, while the reference to, quote, value, end quote, concerns value sought as an external measure of value. In the latter case, the issue concerns the monetary expression of value as part of its, quote, exhibition, end quote. In the former case, the issue concerns the cause of value, which is independent of and presupposed to the, quote, exhibition, end quote. Labor as the immanent measure of value transforms use values into value. Money as the extrinsic measure presupposes the existence of value, as distinct from that commodity's use value. Gold, for example, can only measure the value of cotton if gold and cotton, as values, possess a unity that is distinct from both as use values. Once money, as a measure of value, develops into the standard of price, money presupposes the theoretical transformation from the commodity to money. If the values of all commodities are exhibited as money prices, they can be compared. In fact, they are already compared through, quote, representation, end quote. This is followed in Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3, by a clear description of the exchange process as based on a real and practically, quote, objective, end quote. That is, not a conceptual and psychologically, quote, subjective, end quote, abstraction, acting behind the back of the producers. The same circumstances, independent of the mind, although acting on the mind, that compel producers to sell their products as commodities give them an exchange value that also, for their minds, is independent of their use value. This is, I think, an allusion to money as embodied and absolute value. At this point, thanks to this separation and autonomization of value, The producer's consciousness may well ignore the existence of what determines value. The fundamental thing is that they find themselves placed within relationships that determine their mind without them having to know, just like everyone can use money as money without knowing what money is. Section 3. Quote, where to have it, end quote. Immaterial substances and tangible things. I have no space here to go into Marx's confrontation with Bailey before and after the 1861-63 economic manuscript, hence I will limit myself to a quick sketch. Bailey is not there in the 1844 economic and philosophical Paris manuscripts. Bailey is mostly mentioned in the Grundrisse about specific monetary issues. Discussing Riccardo, Marx asserts that the notion of, quote, absolute value, end quote, is nonsense. However, Marx quotes from Sismondi that trade has separated the shadow from the, quote, shadow, end quote, from the body, from the, quote, body, and has introduced the possibility of possessing them separately. In the last pages of the Grundrisse dealing with, quote, money as money, end quote, Marx writes that during international crises, gold and silver in their metallic form are the, quote, absolute means of payment, end quote, and the, quote, absolute equivalent, end quote. Gold and silver in their metallic form are value für sich seiender, which is, quote, being for itself, end quote. Footnote. Hegel, 1831, says, quote, something is for itself, inasmuch as that something sublates otherness's connection and community with other, has rejected them by abstracting from them, end quote. I have no idea what that fucking means. End footnote. This reference to absolute value when discussing money as money will return in all later writings, and I will not follow this recurrence. In the contribution to the critique of political economy published in 1859, the argument about, quote, absolute value, end quote, is expanded and deepened. At this theoretical juncture, there is an apparent contradictory, vicious circle, as Marx himself admits. The slashed out exchange value, or it has like, I don't know, it's kind of confusing to verbalize what's on the page, but it has like exchange in parentheses with crossed out. So I think the reason for that is that I believe that in like these manuscripts, sometimes Marx is like inconsistent in his word choices. Where exchange value is used in place of value when it should just be value or something like that. I'm not sure. The value of the commodity has been first introduced as our abstraction, or in the consciousness of exchanging producers. Still, the value of a commodity can actually exist only in circulation where commodities relate to one another. To display itself as exchange value, as objectified universal labor time, the commodity must pass through disembodiment of the commodity's use value. However, This, quote, externalization, end quote, already presupposes its being there as an exchange value. While it latently exists in commodities, nevertheless, social labor time reveals itself only in their exchange process. Commodities must enter the process of exchange as objectified universal labor time. Yet, the objectification of the private labor time of individual producers as universal is itself only the result of the exchange process. Many traits of the, quote, absolute value, end quote, as I spotted it in the theories of surplus value, are anticipated, but in a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859, money as a commodity looks like a way to solve, quote, practically, end quote, a theoretical difficulty, which in any case continued to trouble Marx afterwards. Marx writes that in prices all commodities strive for gold as money as the universal commodity. Gold as money as the universal commodity, being exactly a term Marx borrows from Samuel Bailey, as his index confirms. Footnote, quote, it is the, quote, beyond, end quote, of the commodities because in their alienation as externalization, the bodies of their use values leap over to the side of money, while their soul, which is value, jump within gold as money itself. End quote, Marx. End footnote. As the absolute form of value in exchange and as the universal means of payment is the, quote, absolute commodity of contracts, end quote, as Bailey writes again in Money and Its Vicissitudes. Footnote, quote, money is the general commodity of contract, or in that which the majority of bargains about property to be completed at a future time are made, end quote. Samuel Bailey, Money and Its Vicissitudes, London, 1937, page 3. End footnote. In August-November 1858, before finalizing a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859, Marx wrote the notebooks later known as the Urtext. Fragment des Urtextes von zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. Notebook, quote, Notebook B has on its cover the phrase, quote, as means of payment, money for itself, should stand for value as such. In fact, however, money is only an identical quantum of variable value, end quote. Marx. The Marx-Engels collected work editorial comment rightly identifies this as Marx's, quote, free personal summary, end quote, of some of Bailey's points in Money and Its Vicissitudes. Marx's versus Riccardo's notion of absolute value is unmistakably delineated. In the Urtext, there are important integrations to a contributions of 1859's argument on the phenomenal manifestation of the law of appropriation in simple circulation, and on the transition from money parenthesis, as money, and parenthesis, to capital. The absolutization of value is depicted as the condition where society must exist vis-a-vis separated individuals in the form of money as an equally independent, external, accidental, reified relation. It is a relation expressed as the palpably subjectivized universal commodity, hence as a tangible thing. When money, as absolute value, stands opposite commodities, money is a, quote, purely fantastic, end quote, material, end quote, existence. The emphasis is increasingly on the process behind value, quote, in becoming, end quote, a sort of dynamic version of the, quote, absolutization, end quote, of value, detached from any fixed shape. Capital value must remain qualitatively identical in the different phases of the circuit so that a quantitative comparison can be made, which is what Bailey does not understand in his criticism of Riccardo. At this point, quote, absolute, end quote, takes on another connotation deriving from its etymological origin in the Latin verb absolvere, turned into the German absolvieren, something differentiated, accomplishing its end, reaching perfection, and becoming capital O, one. Both money and commodities are nothing but objectified labor. Thereby, the, quote, third, end quote, must be non-objectified labor, labor as subjectivity. This is the second crucial theme of the last section of the text. On this major integration to the argument in a conclusion, I will return near the conclusion of this chapter. For now, I want to stress that to understand Marx's discourse about, quote, intrinsic value, end quote, absolute value, end quote, as distinct through related notions, it is mandatory to go through the logical structure of the first section of Volume 1 of Capital. Mostly I'll refer to the 1872 second German edition since I cannot elaborate on other versions for space reasons. At the beginning, we find the commodity as a singularity, articulated in a, quote, inner duality, end quote, where the body of the product to be sold on the market, its use value, is declared to be the bearer of an exchange value. Exchange values at first are phenomenally manifested, erscheint, as the quantitative ratios in which, quote, physical, end quote, use values are traded, according to proportions which seem, scheint, somewhat arbitrary, depending on the perpetual fluctuations of supply and demand. This is exactly the view of Bailey as a, quote, vulgar, end quote, political economist. A, quote, intrinsic value, end quote, a valeur intrinsique, that is, an inner, quote, exchange value, end quote, immanent within the commodity, would be a contradictio in adjecto, because the adjective predicates something contradictory with the noun. Marx clearly disagrees and qualifies this opinion as a, quote, semblance, end quote, shine. This unfolds a problem setting leading to a second, more appropriate definition of, quote, exchange value, end quote. The exteriorization of a communal identity positing commodities as homogeneous and immanent to them, which is phenomenally manifested in exchange value. In the Penguin translation, quote, to appear, end quote, translates both erscheinen and scheinen, which is confusing. Excuse me, where am I? Spaced out for a second. This unfolds a problem setting leading to a second, more appropriate definition of, quote, exchange value, end quote. The exteriorization of a communal identity positing commodities as homogeneous and immanent to them. This is phenomenally manifested in exchange value. Footnote. In the Penguin translation, quote, to appear, end quote, translates both erscheinen and scheinen, which is confusing. In Marx Engels' collected works, erscheinen is translated as, quote, to present itself, end quote, and scheinen as, quote, to appear, end quote, which could be accepted, but I remind my readers that I use, quote, to appear, end quote, erscheinen, end quote, to seem, end quote, verscheinen. See Appendix 1. End footnote. Marx acknowledges that one may twist and turn a commodity as one pleases, it remains, quote, immaterial, end quote, as a thing of value. The point is clarified through his quote from Shakespeare. The natural, crude, and tangible objectivity of the single commodity as a use value is immediately accessible. On the contrary, its peculiar, quote, value objectivity, end quote, Wertgegenständlichkeit, is unlike Dame Quickly in Henry IV. Quote, one does not know where to have it, end quote. Footnote. Oh, no footnote. At this moment of the exposition, value is nothing but a ghost, a, quote, ethereal, end quote, presence which does not yet exist. Etymological research is once again enlightening. Quote, ghost, end quote, derives from a Proto-West Germanic word meaning, quote, supernatural being, end quote, and can be associated to the Latin spiritus, meaning a disembodied soul, and to the Greek, something spelled in Greek, an apparition or phantom which is only seeming reality. In, quote, ghost, end quote, there is thus an intriguing ambiguity between two meanings, which quite well lays bare what is going on. On the one hand, it is an illusory, non-existent image. On the other, it is a shadow, a specter, a frightening vision of some dead person haunting the living. In both cases, the, quote, objectivity, end quote, of this uniquely social reality is not obvious. The ghosts that commodities contain take possession of a body through their, quote, embodiment, end quote. Verkörperung in money as a commodity, gold or silver as a product of labor. Money is defined as, quote, embodied value, end quote. Verkörperter Wert. The isolated, quote, absolute value, end quote, as a fetish. Marx is going to dissolve the fetishism that spontaneously arises from this fetish character, showing first how this, quote, thing of value, end quote, springs necessarily from the relation that commodities entertain with each other, and second, how that reified social relation conceals a specific social relation going on among human beings in their practical form of life under capital as universalized production of commodities. To accomplish this task and hence reveal the mystery of money, Marx turns to the, quote, form of value, end quote, as a polar relation, opposing and uniting the commodities. It is something which was not there at the time of his comments about Bailey. It was, in fact, Marx's confrontation with Bailey that oriented him in this direction. I cannot explore the issue adequately in this section, so I content myself with a reminder that 1. In the simple form of value, the commodity in the relative form of value is playing an active, end quote, role, and thereby outwardly expresses the inner ghostly objectivity of the commodity in the relative form of value, while the body of the commodity in the relative form of value's own use value is playing no function at all. 2. The commodity in the equivalent form of value, which is playing the quote passive end quote role, displays in its own use value that ghostly objectivity, now incarnated in a thing. In an adequate material form, a materiatur. The theoretical wording alluding to incarnation lets us see what is happening here. The use value of gold as money, displayed in circulation as, quote, absolute value, end quote, that is, as, quote, embodied value, end quote, acts as the phenomenal form of the commodity's value, quote, as such, end quote. Footnote. A sensible, more transparent translation of Schlechten is, quote, pure and simple, end quote, as below. At the same time, the concrete and private labor producing, quote, money as a commodity, end quote, acts as the phenomenal form of the commodity's abstract and social labor. In a certain sense, money is the commodity. This Riccardian commodity nature of money cannot be too easily thrown out, as the post-1970s literature has done. It has nothing to do with a groundless theoretical assumption derived from peculiar historical circumstances. This Riccardian commodity nature of money performs a cogent and central logical role in the, quote, internal connection, end quote. Within this train of thought, the reference to absolute value is plainly there for those who are alert enough to see it. Relevant here is a quote from Chapter 3. I report Hans Ehrbar's translation, which has the merit of fully making explicit Marx's nuances. I report Hans Ehrbar's translation, which has the merit of fully making explicit Marx's nuances. Quote, money is the absolute alienable commodity, bracket, die absolut veraußerliche Ware, because it is the disembodied shape, bracket, enthalterte Gestalt, end bracket, of all other commodities, the product of their universal externalization, alienation, bracket, allgemeinen Veräußerung, end bracket, end quote, Marx. It's translated by Hans Ehrbar. In his 1871 to 72 Ergänzungen und Veränderungen zum ersten Band des Kapital, or Additions and Changes to the First Volume of Capital, Marx writes that the nature of the value of the commodity is that of being a, quote, thingly, end quote, expression, dinglicher Ausdruck, end quote, reified, end quote, shell, sachliche Hülle, of the human labor power spent in that commodity's production, that is, gelatin, galerta, of human labor, abstract human labor pure and simple, schlechten. The other commodity can be posited as equal, gleichgesetzt werden, only as long as it is regarded just as, quote, a mere thing of value, end quote, blasses Wertding. That is, as long as its material consists of objectified human labor, its body exhibits nothing but human labor. Money can thus be a value thing because money is itself a commodity that is produced by labor. In the value relation between commodities, the equivalent, hence gold is money, is at once the, quote, the common body. I'll repeat that. Hence gold is money is at once the, quote, common body of commodities, end quote, gemeiner Warenkörper, and the, quote, ghost-made flesh, end quote, Gespensterleib, Gespensterleib, and as this latter is also the, quote, chrysalis, end quote, Verpackung of abstract human labor. Footnote. In Capital 1 second edition, Marx writes that the universal relative form of value of the commodity world assigns to the, quote, excluded, end quote, equivalent commodity the character of the universal equivalent. The natural form of this universal equivalent is their common shape of value, Wertgestalt, directly exchangeable with all other commodities. The bodily form, Körperform, counts as the visible incarnation, the universal social chrysalis of every human labor. The theory of surplus value, quote, absolute value, end quote, is translated into the, quote, polarities, end quote, of the form of value. On chrysalis and butterfly, ghost and vampires, I have written extensively for the last 20 years at least. One example is Bellofiore's 2016 piece, whose title has been defined as, quote, exotic, end quote, by a reviewer. Though it is certainly unusual, it is quite close to Marx's text. End footnote. Once the duality within the commodity between, quote, useful thing, end quote, and, quote, value thing, end quote, is consolidated in universal exchange, which is in fact assumed by Marx from the beginning of Capital, there is no place in his theory for Engels' simple commodity production as a historical stage underpinning universal simple exchange. The character of value is already taken into consideration in production itself. From this moment on, the private labors of producers take on a double social character before commodity circulation. Quote, the value of a commodity exists only in that commodity's own body. Iron, linen, and corn are values because human labor has been expended in their production. But iron, linen, and corn's value does not come into sight in the iron, linen, and corn's actuality. in the iron, linen, and corn's bodies. The relative form in which value sensuously comes to light is, therefore, only a merely ideal, represented form, because the relative form in which these commodities' values sensuously comes to light is distinct from the actual being there of its value. What is true of the relative form of value in general is also true of price. In their prices, iron, linen, grain, etc., possess a figure of value insofar as the prices of iron, linen, and grain represent gold quanta. Gold is a sensuously (sinnlich) and distinct thing from iron, linen, grain. And in their prices, iron, linen, and grain refer to gold as another thing, which is, however, iron, linen, and grains equivalent in value. Iron, linen, and grain are therefore displayed as values in that iron, linen, and grain are represented as gold equal. End quote, Marx. In these pages, Marx is tracing the path from the ethereal ghosts to the existence within the single commodity through price, quote, representing, end quote, gold, and then its conversion into the subject. Marx will add the adjective, quote, automatic, end quote, only in 1871 to 72. Footnote: in Capital 1, second edition, what is lost from the chapter of the first edition is the explicit homology that Marx here pointed out between the absolutization of value and Hegel's absolute idea. I think that this is unfortunate. Even though Marx's reading of Hegel as absolute idealist was problematic, it is that Hegel who allowed Marx to grasp the peculiar ontology of capitalism. I'm not sure if it is the first chapter of the first edition of Capital that I have on here, but I have the first chapter of Capital Volume 1 from the God, what the fuck is the guy's name? I want to say it's like Haberstand or something like that. But in like Michael Heinrich's book, for that's like the first 7 chapters of Capital, there's referenced in that text a translation of Capital and a translation of like the production processes, the results of the production process as a whole, or something, whatever that piece is called. And there's in that book, there's a translation of one of the chapters of Volume 1, and I think because it has this more esoteric character, that's why Heinrich references it. But what was I saying? What I mean by that is that I think that this chapter, the reason I'm saying any of this is because I think that chapter, this original first edition chapter of Capital 1, is on this channel if you care to listen to it. But I can't be certain. I'd have to look it up. Section 4. What has exploitation got to do with it? Marx's critique of Bailey revolves around one big theme, which is at once also a critique of Riccardo, the inability to understand the, quote, externalization and, quote, absolutization of value. It is the process by which the intertemporal condensation of value is embodied in money as absolute value, and by which money is transformed in capital as value in process, absolute value as the capital S subject. Quote, absolute value is the expression in the form of a thing of something inherently, quote, relative. The social relation between human beings, on the one hand, and their mutual productive activity as a separate entity governing them on the other. This incarnation of intrinsic value, value as a, quote, ghost, in money as value embodied, value as, quote, chrysalis, end quote, exhibits what unites the world of commodities. All of them are portions of a specifically social labor bearing a peculiar, quote, form determination, end quote. I build on the point Marx is advancing in Part 1 of Capital 1. Behind the quantitative ratios of exchange and commodity circulation, there must be a previously grounded qualitative unity, Einheit. Marx finds this foundation in production. It is labor, and the imminent, quote, measure, end quote, being in socially necessary time. This identity, identitet, is not immediate, however. It has to pass through money as the external measure. This measurement leads to a monetary expression of that labor time. The exhibition of values, quote, as such, in circulation is also an expression from the inner to the outer. There's a couple footnotes here. Footnote 1, see Finesci 2001 for the distinction between A, measure, according to which the, quote, imminent, end quote, or inner measure is the socially necessary labor time, B, measuring device, the, quote, external or outer measure, money, and C, measurement, which happens only ex post within commodity circulation. End footnote. Next footnote. After Part 1, the exhibition will be explicitly of the class relation of production, a term encompassing the, quote, buying and selling of labor power, end quote, and, quote, immediate production, end quote. End of footnote. The argument is that commodities can be compared quantitatively because commodities are identically equal because of this qualitative, quote, unity. Suppose gold is money as a commodity produced by labor, and that gold is exchanged with other commodities produced by labor. In that case, prices are performing in advance a quantitative homogenization, Gleichung, as, quote, value as form, end quote, of commodities, quote, value as content, end quote. In other words, the commodity enters the market with an already given value in terms of gold as money and is conceptually made equal with other commodities beforehand. Producers' expectations may be disappointed. Footnote. In Napoleone, 1976, it is clarified that Marx's law of value is at the same time a theory of equilibrium and disequilibrium, of order and disorder. End footnote. When commodities are produced to be sold on the market, the measured commodities and the measuring commodity must be identical in tertium. This tertium being labor as living activity, the quote cause, end quote, once it is quote congealed, end quote, as dead labor in the commodity product. This identity of values in social labor, justifying labor as the immanent measure, arises logically earlier. The external, measuring through the expression of those values in money prices, follows later. The determination, that is, generation, of value refers to labor as the activity in becoming, which posits value. Value measurement refers instead to commodities and money as already presupposed objectified entities. It is true that the extrinsic measure is in the display of value has to do with the Darstellung in the unitary quote codetermination, end quote, of production and circulation, but the inner ground and cause of value has to do with the Ausdruck, the movement quote from, end quote, production, where the constitution or formation of value emerges, quote, to, end quote, circulation, where the exhibition of value is displayed. Napoleon was right in observing that, quote, abstract labor and value are in fact the same thing, seen on the one hand as an activity and on the other as a result, end quote. If this is translated, a la Isaac Illich Rubin, in a processual reconstruction of abstract labor, value and money as only capitalistic notions. Labor in becoming, the activity objectified in value as content, is, as Hans-Georg Backhaus claimed, the ens realissimum, the motor of the movement of capital. In my reconstruction, however, value, quote, in general, end quote, is no longer premonetary, like in Backhaus, since value is ante-validated by money as finance to production, like in monetary circuit theory. Value is also validated before circulation by, quote, value as form, end quote, or ideal money, thus avoiding any risk of a, quote, two worlds view, end quote. Footnote, like in Heinrich, at least according to the interpretation by Backhaus and Reichelt, see Appendix 2 on interpretations. Marx's argument is based on the doubtful assumption that looking for a, quote, end footnote. Marx's argument is based on the doubtful assumption that looking for a, quote, unity, end quote, behind the value of commodities as objectified labor is equivalent to tracing back the latter to labor. Here, the text is fundamental in allowing to convincingly ground new value in the objectification of living labor. To show this, let me go back and complete Marx's argument on the transition from money as money to capital in his 1859, quote, fragment. The absolutization of value presupposes circulation as a developed moment and presents itself as a continuous process, which posits circulation and always returns from it to pose it again. Active value is the only value that posits surplus value. Money that has become autonomous is exchange value in circulation. Multiplied in it and through it is capital. As capital, money has lost money's rigidity, from a tangible thing as capital, money has become a process. The becoming autonomous of capital stands in relation with a, quote, third, end quote. But this cannot be commodities, nor money, because both commodities and money are objectified labor. The only antithesis to objectified labor is not objectified labor. Therefore, Marx concludes it is subjectified labor. The antithesis to spatially existing labor, past in time, is living labor, present in time. The latter is the living subject's capacity for work, or the capacity of labor that exists as a subject. Footnote. This is what actually is wrongly labeled as, quote, living labor, end quote, in most secondary literature. That is why for some years I have distinguished it, as in the following phrases, from direct labor, the labor which has been spent within the period, as the objectification of living labor, labor in motion, a fluid not yet determined until the end of immediate production. Steedman is right that, quote, after the harvest, end quote, to borrow Strauss's phrase, Marx's value is redundant. End footnote. The only exchange through which money can become capital is that which the possessor of money concludes with the possessors of the living labor capacity, that is, with workers. The only commodity they have to offer is precisely their living labor capacity, present in their living corporeity, its use value as labor as an activity, when that capacity is put in motion, making them work. The real non-capital is, quote, labor, end quote, itself. For money as capital, there is no other use value. Labor capacity itself is the use value whose consumption immediately coincides with the objectification of labor, and thus with positing value and exchange value. This is where the text argument leads, and the logical step forward is in capital 1, chapter 7, second paragraph. Verwertungsprozess, the valorization process. Bailey is right in criticizing Riccardo's circular determination of value by the value of labor. Labor power must be recognized as a commodity and distinguished by labor as such. The proper answer to the question, quote, what is it, end quote, is recognizing that, quote, the third thing, end quote, which can not be either a value or a commodity, is not circular but linear, going back to what transforms products into commodities and constitutes products as values. This obliges us to investigate the problematic internal connection of, quote, labor power, end quote, labor as activity, end quote, within, quote, living labor power, end quote, that is, workers themselves. Quote, labor capacity, end quote, is attached to them, and, quote, labor in motion, end quote, springs from them. If it is so, the, quote, third thing, end quote, ultimately must be identified with the whole of living labor as a, quote, fluid, end quote. That is, with the total social labor, which is objectified as direct labor. I think that this constellation reveals an Aristotelian moment in Marx's value theory. In Aristotle, we can distinguish the moments of abstract, quote, potentiality, end quote, as the generic possibility of becoming something, and the concrete, quote, possibility, end quote, as the, quote, potency, end quote, or the power of producing reality. The latter, possibility, is relevant for Marx. The concrete, quote, possibility as the, quote, potency or the power of producing reality is relevant for Marx. The reference being exactly to a processual reading of the real abstraction of labor as a movement or process capable of making explicit and implicit form. Aristotle gave primacy to actuality over potentiality. In the scholastic reprise of this same theme, the hierarchy was sometimes reversed, which appears to be what happened with Marx. This Aristotelian moment was, I think, particularly evident in the Grundrisse and in the text, and should be regained in the more mature Marx of Capital I, where it is less visible. The reference to Aristotle is also decisive in appreciating the meaning of, quote, substance, end quote, in Marx. As David Andrews argues, quote, the choice of substance to express Aristotle's, I don't know what that is it's some word in Greek, is particularly egregious. In modern English and German, these terms have lost any connection whatsoever with Aristotle's and therefore Hegel's and Marx's meaning. This was not a problem for Hegel and Marx because they were deeply engaged with Aristotle in the original Greek. They could use Latin terms without misunderstanding when writing in German. For us, the situation is completely different. Their use is complete fantasy. The point can be made clearer by referring to Joe Sachs' introduction to a translation of Aristotle's Physics. Quote, in the central books of the metaphysics, Aristotle captures the heart of the meaning of being in a cluster of words and phrases that are the most powerful expressions of his thinking. The usual translation of them not only fall flat but miss the central point, that the thinghood of a thing is what it keeps on being in order to be at all, and must be a being at work, so that it may achieve and sustain its being at work, staying itself. In the standard translation of those words and phrases, that rich and powerful thought turns into the following mush. The substance of a thing is a thing's essence, and it must be an actuality, so that it may achieve and sustain its actuality. End quote. Joe Sachs. I think Andrews and Sachs are absolutely right, and I think my reference to Guido Colagero is attempting to go in the same direction. Footnote. See Calogero's entries in Encyclopedia Treccani. I would add a third Aristotelian moment, in my interpretation and reconstruction at least. Intrinsic value within the single commodity must be regarded as the, quote, synalon, end quote. That is, as the compound of value as content. That is, latent abstract labor. And value as form, that is, ideal money. Conclusion. Marx's is a journey from ghost to fetish, where intrinsic value turns into money as absolute value, which becomes capital. Value is portrayed as a self-determining integral whole, Gestalt, which has, so to speak, conquered an autonomous, independent reality. Only then is, quote, intrinsic value, end quote, grasped as the beginning just as an ethereal ghost, transformed into a material, though only social, quote, substance, end quote, of the value internal to the single commodity. As the etymology suggests, this subspecies is literally, quote, coming from under, end quote. Though admittedly Marx is far from transparent here, at least for the modern reader. From this perspective, as I have concluded, substance is to be understood as the, quote, compound of value as content, which is a labor amount, and value as form, which is its ideal money representation, Vorstellung, in the price tag. It cannot be reduced to a non-monetary or pre-monetary dimension. Footnote. See on this Blunden, 2022. Blunden also argues that in Marx, Gestalt can be brought back to Goethe's meaning as, quote, the overall dynamic configuration of a living thing, end quote. See also Blunden's translation from Goethe. Quote, the Germans have a word for the complex of existence presented by a physical organism, Gestalt. With this expression, they exclude what is changeable and assume that an interrelated whole is identified, defined, and fixed in character. But if we look at all these Gestalten, especially the organic ones, we will discover that nothing in them is permanent, nothing is at rest or defined, everything is in a flux of continual motion. This is why German frequently and fittingly makes use of the word Bildung to describe the end product and what is in process of production as well. Thus, in setting forth a morphology, we should not speak of Gestalt, or if we use the term, we should at least do so only in reference to the idea, the concept, or to an empirical element held fast for a mere moment of time. End quote. See Gestalt in the glossary of terms in the Marxist Internet Archive. End footnote. Marxian theory of value was directly concerned with explaining how valorization is possible, to account for the source of the value added, and thus to understand the generation of surplus value. The text in Chapter 7 of Capital 1 suggests that the answer lies in, quote, the, quote, consumption, end quote, of the living bearers of labor power, that is, in the antagonistic extraction from the living bearers of labor power of living labor by capital as a vampire. This outcome cannot be taken for granted in capitalism as a historically social specific situation. As the whole of Volume 1 shows, it depends on what Etienne Balibar has called, quote, class struggle in production, end quote. That is why capitalist production is nothing but labor, and this is the ultimate foundation of Marx's value theory of labor. The living labor objectified is displayed in the money value added. This monetary exhibition is true to be looked at as the exchange value. It is the labor contained in the commodities comprised in the net product and bought by money in circulation. Absolute value, abstracted, separated, and autonomized. The, quote, value added, end quote, in the period is conflictually shared between the capitalist class and the working class. The macro-social division of the total labor pumped out from capital is accurately portrayed in the social accounting in terms of labor contained. Footnote. The capitalist price setting of individual commodities determines a divergence between the amount of labor required to produce the commodities and the amount of labor commanded in circulation by the price of those commodities. It is a necessary distortion in the phenomenal manifestation of surplus value, as gross monetary profits and the value of labor power, as the monetary wage bill, an example of what in Bachhaus terminology are the verrückte Formen, that is, quote, deranged, quote, crazy, quote, displaced, end quote, forms. This point was not realized by Marx himself. See Bellofiore and Coveri, 2021, end footnote. If Marxian theory is reconstructed as a monetary analysis in the sense of Schumpeter and Keynes, and if Marxian theory is prolonged to become a truly macro-monetary theory of capitalist production and distribution, the notion of absolute value does not disappear. Footnote: as I have clarified many times, the meaning of the expression, quote, macro-monetary, end quote, is quite distant from the use of the term in contemporary Marxists such as Fred Mosley, 2016. The label, quote, macro-monetary, end quote, in my case directly descends from the use of the term in Italian monetary circuit theory in authors such as Graziani, Missori, and myself since the early 1980s. End footnote. Where am I? The qualitative, quote, unity, end quote, Einheit, that Marx identifies is redefined as a quantitative total magnitude. The labor contained in the new value which has been added during the period, which is the macro foundation having priority over individual pricing. The, quote, exchange value, end quote, for the current commodity output, the, quote, world of commodities, end quote, is the monetary exhibition of the objectification of total living labor. The same notion of individual, quote, exchange value, end quote, that is, the simple or direct price as the ratio between the labor required to produce the commodities exchanged, is maintained as the necessary intermediate category between value and price of production. Circulation at exchange values, simple or direct prices, follows the price rule which gives a, quote, perspicuous presentation, end quote, übersichtliche Darstellung, of the confrontation between capital and labor in the labor process as contested terrain. Quote, absolute value, end quote, that is, the condensation of living labor as total new value in commodity circulation, and, quote, exchange values, end quote, the price ratios proportional to the labor contained in commodities, make transparent the class allocation of the objectification of living labor, and supply the mediation from the macro dimension to the micro dimension. I have some footnotes here. The expression, quote, direct price, end quote, comes from Anwar Sheikh. The expression, quote, simple price, end quote, comes from Michel de Vroey in writings of the late 1970s and early 1980s. And the next footnote says, I am borrowing the expression from Wittgenstein, according to which a, quote, perspicuous presentation produces precisely that kind of understanding which consists in, quote, seeing the connections, end quote. Hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate links, end quote. That's from section 122 of Philosophical Investigations in the modified translation of Martin, 2016. The term is translated very often as, quote, surveyable, end quote, or, quote, perspicuous representation, end quote. in French as tableau synoptique, in Italian rappresentazione perspicua. I prefer, quote, perspicuous presentation, end quote. See also the note on Darstellung in Appendix 1 on translation. End footnote. Where the hell was I? Just let me reread it. I'm going to have to reread the sentence. Circulation and exchange values, simple or direct prices, follows the price rule, which gives a, quote, perspicuous presentation of the confrontation between capital and labor in the labor process as contested terrain. Quote, absolute value, end quote. That is, the condensation of living labor as total new value in commodity circulation. And exchange value, end quote, exchange values, end quote, the price ratio is proportional to the labor contained in commodities. Make transparent the class allocation of the objectification of living labor and supply the mediation from the macro dimension to the micro dimension. Marx's macro monetary value theory of labor is here grounded in exploitation. Deciphered both as the consumption of workers as the human bearers of labor power, resulting in total living labor, and as the prolongation of living labor over and above necessary labor, resulting in surplus labor. This argument does not require, quote, money as a commodity, end quote, and can retrospectively justify the assumption at the beginning of capital which relates value back to labor. Within a view where the valorization process is anti-validated by the banking system financing the production of the firm sector, Graziani wrote at the end of the article, quote, let's rehabilitate the theory of value, end quote. Quote, the problem of valorization comes upon the class of capitalists in its relations with workers. The exchange of commodities as a phenomenon within the capitalist class is a quite different problem. Surplus value and profit can only derive from a relation between the two classes. But the exchange of commodities is quite a different thing inasmuch as it is a phenomenon within the class of capitalists. This area is governed by the rules of competitive equilibrium, analyzed 8,001 times from the general equilibrium of Walras, the Stroeffel's theory of prices. These rules indeed explain the determination of relative prices in the exchange of commodities. Such exchanges do not shape relations between classes and have nothing to do with the phenomenon of valorization. Analysis of the relations between the classes, or social macroeconomic analysis on the one hand, and analysis of relations within a class or competitive microeconomic analysis on the other, are disparate phenomena that for that reason are governed by their own logic, end quote. Graziani. In this reconstruction of Marx's reasoning, it remains valid that the exhibition of values, quote, as such, end quote, in circulation is also, quote, an expression, end quote, from the inner to the outer, but in a different formulation, crucial from the point of view of the constitution of capital as social relation. The, quote, inner, end quote, does not refer anymore just to, quote, immediate production, end quote, but encompasses the, quote, buying and selling of labor power, end quote, before it. Maybe Marx's is a discourse not too far from what Stroeffer had in mind when in the 1920s, Stroeffer wrote a note entitled, quote, Cause and Measure of Value, end quote, arguing that the, quote, classics, when they speak of, quote, invariable measure, end quote, mean really cause, end quote, quoting Marx's theories of surplus value in a French translation and Bailey's dissertation. Maybe this view does not sit too well with the investigation about the standard commodity. It is nevertheless in continuity with his 1940 note about the use of the notion of surplus value and the consequent and possible interpretation of the normalizations in Straffa's 1960 book, the net product as numeraire and direct labor as unit, as compatible with Marx's value theory of labor. Okay, that's the end of the essay. Yeah, now I'm gonna look. There's appendix here, but I want to look at the references real quick. One piece is by an L. Abinus, 2016. Wittgenstein, Fraser, and the Apples of Sodom, and L. Albinus, J.G.F. Rothhaupt, and A. Seary. Edited volume, Wittgenstein's Remarks on Fraser, the Text and the Matter. The next reference is C.J. Arthur, 1986, Dialectics of Labor, Marx and His Relation to Hegel. The next is C.J. Arthur's recent book of 2022, The Spectre of Capital, Idea and Reality. A piece by Backhaus, another piece by Backhaus. A piece by Diethard Behrens and K. Hafner. I have a piece by Diethard Behrens in on this channel, but it's about I think it's about Leninism. Bellafiore's Lost in Translation, once again on the Marx-Hegel connection. Bellofiore, Chrysalis and Butterfly, Ghost and Vampire. Bellofiore, something in Italian. Bellofiore, Adventures of the Vergesellschaftung. Bellofiore, Forever Young, Marx's Critique of Political Economy After 200 Years. Bellofiore and A. Coveri, The Transformation Problem, from the Sage Handbook of Marxism. Andy Blunden, Hegel, Marx, and Vygotsky, Essays on Social Philosophy. Helmut Brentel, something in German. C. Campbell, 2017, Marx's Transition to Money with No Intrinsic Value and Capital. Lucio Coletti, 1969, From Rousseau to Lenin, Studies in Ideology and Society. Lucio Coletti, 1969, Marxism and Hegel. Something from Lucio Coletti in Italian. Something by an A. Dawes, 1996. Something by an H.G. Ehrbar, Annotations to Karl Marx's Capital. Roberto Finesci, something in Italian. J. Ferner, Marx's Critique of Samuel Bailey. C. Gurka, Absolute Value and Invariable Measure of Value. That's in Heinz D. Kurz, and I can't remember the first person's name. Eldgard, Companion to Classical Economics. Graziani, Let's Rehabilitate the Theory of Value. Something by K. Hartmann in German. Hegel's Science of Logic. Heinrich's Science of Value in German. Another piece by Heinrich. A piece by Andrew Kleiman titled Marx's Concept of Intrinsic Value. M. Lippi, 1976, Value and Naturalism in Marx. Luxemburg, Reformer Revolution. C.G. Martin, Wittgenstein on Perspicuous Presentations and Grammatical Self-Knowledge. L. Mayer, something by L. Mayer, 2005. Fred Mosley, 2016. Money in Totality, a macro monetary interpretation of Marx's Logic and Capital on the end of the, quote, transformation problem, end quote. Patrick Murray's 2016 volume, Measure of Wealth, essays on Marx and social form, can't recommend that enough. Some pieces by Claudio Napoleoni. The only one that's in English is from 1988, titled Value and Exploitation, Marx's Economic Theory and Beyond, in Caravelle, Marx and Modern Economic Analysis. Something by an E. Naikos, Das Kapital as Prozess, or Prozess. Something by a C. Penavaja from 1976. Tommaso Redolfi Riva, 2018. Samuel Bailey and David Riccardo and Karl Marx's Dialectic of the Form of Value. Helmut Reichholtz, 2002. Marx's Critique of Economic Categories, Reflections on the Problem of Validity in the Dialectical Method of Presentation in Capital. That was in Historical Materialism. Reichholtz, Social Reality as Appearance, Some Notes on Marx's Conception of Reality in Bonafelt Encyclopedicis, Human Dignity, Social Autonomy, and the Critique of Capitalism. Something by Helmut Reichholtz in German. Something A. Roncaglia, Sraffa and the Theory of Prices. A. Roncaglia, Piero Sraffa. Isaac Illich Rubin, The Dialectical Development of the Categories in Marx's Economic System, and Richard B. Day and Daniel Guaido's Responses to Marx's Capital, from Rudolf Hilferding to Isaac Illich. J. Sachs, 2004, Aristotle's Physics, A Guided Study. Hai Hak Tran, something by them, 2003, and something from 2017 by T. Tarako. Now there's a little, now we get at the appendix. Appendix 1, Lost in Translation. Ausdrücken is equal to express something. From inner to the outer. Darstellung is equal to, quote, exhibition, quote, display, or, quote, presentation. Also, quote, exposition, which may be trickier in English, and accordingly for darstellen, quote, to exhibit, quote, to display, quote, to present, also, quote, to expose. Footnote. In this case, something more must be said. Darstellung derives etymologically from, quote, to put something there, end quote. Here the accent is on the exposition through which the truth of the object of the inquiry emerges, thanks to the connections that the exhibition reveals in its course, which is at the same time an outer expression and transformation of the thing itself. What Albinus writes about Wittgenstein also applies to Marx. He, quote, did not point to a revocation of something already self-identically present as implicitly suggested by the word, quote, representation, end quote, but rather wanted to point to something that emerges from the very construction of joining links, end quote. Quote, represent, end quote. The usual translation is inappropriate since represent derives from re and presens, meaning to present again. A better choice, but awkward in English, as it is not in Italian, which partially explains the preference by Finesci, is, quote, expose, end quote, from exponere. The one I chose is quote, to exhibit, end quote, which is very much a synonym of the latter, meaning, quote, to present to view, end quote, quote, to show, to, quote, display, and the like. End footnote. Dasein Dasein means, quote, being there, end quote. Also sometimes, quote, existence, end quote. Ding Sache is equal to the former as, quote, physical or natural thing, end quote. Ding is equal to, quote, physical or natural thing, end quote. Sache as, quote, matter, case, end quote, and the like. Einverleiben means to embody, meaning including some as a part. Enthalten means to contain, and hence, quote, contained labor, end quote. Definitely not, quote, embodied, end quote, labor. As in most translations, the expression embodied labor is appropriate for concrete labor, not abstract labor. Erscheinung means necessary, quote, phenomenal manifestation, end quote, of the essence, the way the latter cannot but appear. Erscheinen, equal, quote, to appear, end quote, or better, quote, to manifest, end quote. Important, quote, appear, end quote, is never to be used for scheinen. There is no essence separated from the form of, quote, appearance, end quote. Fetish character and fetishismus is equal to fetish character and, quote, fetishismus. Not to be identical. I think it's supposed to be fetishism. Gegenständlich and related terms means refers to, quote, becoming objective, end quote. The objectivity standing in front of human beings is something which has its origin in the processual moment of labor as activity. I am in favor of Finesci's Italian translation as Gegenständlichkeit as Oggettualita, quote, objectuality, end quote. But I fear this term would be problematic for most English readers, so here I rather use objectivity as objectification. Gestalt means, quote, shape, quote, figure, distinguishing it from, quote, form. Materiatur, I leave this unusual old term in German. In capital 1 expresses the fact that the material representing value in money as a commodity must have some peculiar properties which make it adequate to a proper expression and form of manifestation of value itself. Naturwüchsige Gesellschaftliche means, quote, natural, spontaneous, but social, end quote, in contrast to the, quote, natural and spontaneous, end quote, division of labor in pre-existing communities. It is meant in a negative sense, referring to connections not yet subjected to conscious human action. Offenbarung means, quote, revelation, end quote, belonging to a theological vocabulary. Accordingly, offenbaren, quote, to reveal, end quote. Shine means, quote, semblance, end quote, quote, seeming, end quote, may be illusory, opening to, quote, vulgar, end quote, explanations. Scheinen means to seem. Übergreifen and related terms means, quote, over grasping, end quote, but also, quote, overreaching, end quote, and, quote, overriding, bordering on, quote, dominant. Unterschied means, quote, distinction, end quote. Verauserung and related terms means it is an, quote, alienation, end quote, which is first of all a, quote, externalization, end quote. Okay. Verkörperung is equal to, quote, embodiment, and hence verkörpern is equal to, quote, equal, quote, to embody, meaning, quote, to present in a physical shape, end quote. I do not render them as, quote, incarnation, quote, to incarnate, end quote, since Marx uses incarnation with a specific emphasis. Verrückte Formen means, quote, perverted and crazy, quote, deranged forms of appearance. Vorstellung means, quote, representation of imagination. Vorstellen means, quote, to represent, end quote, meaning forming ordinary conceptions and ideas, hence also leading to notional anticipations. Wirklich means, quote, actual, or, quote, effective, end quote, better than, quote, real, end quote. There's another appendix here. Where am I? This appendix is titled Lost in Interpretation. What precedes is an exercise about reading Marx's confrontation with Bailey and Riccardo on, quote, absolute value, end quote, oriented by an interpretation of his economic writing as a monetary value theory of labor. In this appendix, I cannot provide a survey of the secondary literature. I will just give a list of some references intersecting my topic with a few telegraphic comments. On Marx on Bailey, the debate between James Ferner, 2004, and Patrick Murray, 2016, is vitiated, as almost all Anglo-Saxon commentaries, by not paying attention to the serious errors of translation, which are therefore cropping up in their quotes. Andrew Kleiman, as well as Martha Campbell, do not distinguish intrinsic and absolute value. Kleiman denies the presence of absolute value in the notion of absolute value in Marx. Campbell is blind to the essentiality of money as a commodity for Marx's value theory. The key role of, quote, money as a commodity, end quote, in Capital One, and hence of money as embodied value, in anticipating the existence of value before the exchange, is usually lost in most interpreters. Tony Smith, at least to my knowledge, does not seem to have room for absolute value in his books and articles, but only for intrinsic value, unproblematically identified with the value dimension. Gert Reuten never discussed absolute value and intrinsic value. He considered, though, its immanent / extroversive or inner-outer aspects in a way that is partially different than mine. Tommaso Redolfi Riva 2018, is a very well researched and careful dissection of Marx on Bailey, but like Murray 2016, fast forwards to the polarity of the form of value with the inconvenience of obscuring the specificity of Marxian meaning of, quote, absolute value, end quote, in theories of surplus value. Tran 2003, on the contrary, accurately depicts Marx's position that the value, quote, relation, end quote, must be analyzed, turning the couple relative absolute value of theories of surplus value 2 into the polarity relative equivalent form of value in capital 1. Tran overlooks that absolute value in theories of surplus value is, quote, canceled, end quote, by being, quote, maintained in capital 1, and it is important to understand how this sublation happened. Isaac Illich Rubin was the one who most thoroughly articulated the sensible theoretical presentation on his own, which is nearest to Marx, of what is at issue in this chapter. But strangely, Rubin's appraisal is disappointing when dealing with Marx's engagement with Bailey, especially on absolute value. But in Rubin, 1929, he gets the point absolutely right when he concludes that, quote, from being a modest representative of commodities, money has become the absolute existence of value, end quote. Isaac Illich Rubin. I have a piece by Isaac Illich Rubin on here, as well as a piece, maybe two, I don't know, about Rubin. The piece is by Bellofiore. In Rubin's own conceptual development of Marx, Rubin eventually understood, quote, absolute value, end quote, much better than in his review of Marx versus Bailey and Riccardo. Christian Gurka, 1998, considers Marx's notion of absolute value in the context of an entry opposing the concept to relative value. Gurka's reading is immediately Ricardian. A commodity's absolute value is the value of that commodity measured against an invariable standard. About Marx, the absolute value of a commodity would be the amount of socially necessary abstract labor required to produce it. All of Marx's mediations are canceled, which may lead to different conclusions at lower levels of concretization. The identification of absolute value with, quote, embodied, end quote, labor in the single commodity as the, quote, substance, end quote, of value is, unfortunately, also in Alessandro Roncaglia's 2009, following Marco Lippi 1976. A much more open, though somehow hesitant discussion about Marx on Bailey and Riccardo was in Roncaglia 1975. Abridged, partially merged, and partially contradicted in the 2009 book. More accurate and profound interpretation of Marx's position were in Italy those of Lucio Coletti and Claudio Napoleoni, and in Germany those by Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt. They all share the view that Marx's value theory is the theory of absolute value. Footnote: the key role of absolute value was already in Klaus Hartmann in 1970, who, however, criticizes the notion. End footnote. Coletti, 2012, recollected his lectures on capital in Rome of the early 1970s. Recollecting his lectures on capital in Rome of the early 1970s, but already Coletti, 1969, in a surprising malgré soi, quite Hegelian last chapter of his Marxism and Hegel, connect the separate and abstract existence of abstract labor and absolute value to a process of hypostatization. Coletti, however, commits a serious error. Coletti maintains that in the commodity as a sensuously supersensuous, quote, thing, the use-value aspect of the commodity's own natural body becomes nothing more than a means that the commodity employs to embody its supersensuous aspect as if in its own body. For Napoleone, 1988, in his last essay, one can speak in Marx of absolute value in a sense quite different from Riccardo, that is, as the product of capital itself, the nature of which is thus highlighted as a historical and not a natural form of production. In his Turin University lectures in the early 1970s, Napoleone came very near the interpretation which I have provided. Money is value, quote, detached, end quote, from particular bodies of commodities and entered into the unique body that is money, as a circumstance intrinsic to the production of value. Napoleone, 1974, was perceptive in associating absolute value with money as a particular and excluding commodity. Unfortunately, Napoleone commits the same blunder as Coletti, arguing that autonomization means that when there is money, exchange value has detached itself from the material body of the commodity and is exhibited in an autonomous form by a particular commodity. This is incorrect. Money is not, quote, exchange value, end quote, made autonomous. Money is, quote, value, namely intrinsic value, the ghost, made autonomous and materialized in a sensible thing, in gold as money, which is then value embodied. This is, properly speaking, exchange value. Footnote. If I understand well, a similar confusion has been detected in Napoleone 1976 by Naikos 2010. Hans-Georg Backhaus is very outspoken in emphasizing the pivotal place of the universal character of value as abstract value, objective value, namely, quote, absolute value, end quote. In his introduction to Backhaus, 1997, the recognized founder of the, quote, monetary value theory, end quote, perspective highlights that one should be aware of refuting pre-monetary value as such. It is not true that absolute pre-monetary value is unthinkable, he writes. Marx's surplus value is a pre-monetary value, the same value, quote, in general, end quote. That is, what in my interpretation is intrinsic value, whose, quote, general characteristics, end quote, contradict its being there within a determinate commodity, is likewise a pre-monetary value. Even though this, quote, pre-monetary, end quote, value cannot be realized as such in a pre-monetary, quote, exchange value, end quote, it is rather manifested in a monetary structure of commodity and money. In its own pre-monetary character, quote, it is the ens realissimum in Adorno's sense. It is the motor of dialectical development. It is a principle that is ultimately only realized in the movement of the world market of capital, end quote. Backhaus, 1997. Backhaus's revisitation of, quote, pre-monetary value, end quote, within a monetary value theory of labor is inseparable from Backhaus's point of view about, quote, absolute value. The most insightful discussion is an essay from the early 1980s, available not in the original German, which has been lost, but in Italian, as well as in Castellano and Danish. what Redolfi, Riva, and I published a few years ago in Bachhaus 2016. The problem is that quite often for Bachhaus, like already in Coletti and Napoleoni, immanent and absolute value and value, quote, as such, end quote, are one and the same, as when he writes that money can only be understood as the phenomenal form of absolute value. He correctly argues that the existence of value He correctly argues that the existence of value cannot be immediately perceived and is exhibited in the being there of money, but this is true of intrinsic value, while absolute value is exactly the phenomenal form of intrinsic value. Moreover, Bachhaus takes for granted, like Marx, that the unity making commodities identical is labor. Quote, if I can only talk reasonably about, quote, labor value, end quote, when it manifests itself in something sensible, and if I am furthermore able to describe certain states of affairs as sensuously suprasensible, then the suprasensible has to some extent also become, quote, perceivable, end quote, as a, quote, existing universal, end quote, or a, quote, existing principle, end quote, end quote. Bachhaus. Footnote. Wait. Yeah. I agree with Erbar, 2010, that, quote, sensible, suprasensible, end quote, means sensuous things which are at the same time extrasensory or social. End footnote. A very similar emphasis on, quote, absolute value, end quote, as part of the formation of the money form is found in Helmut Reichhelt's interpretation of Marx's dialectical development of categories as a preliminary to his critique of Marx, proposing an alternative approach building on the concept of validity. Examples are Reichhelt 2005, 2002, 2007, 2008. The centrality of, quote, absolute value, end quote, is confirmed in Bachhaus and Reichhelt's 1995. The critical review they wrote together in 1995 about the first edition, 1992, of Michael Heinrich's Die Wissenschaft vom Wert, Science of Value. According to the two reviewers, Marx's view of value as an ethereal ghost is truly exposed to the risk of landing into a theory of the, quote, two worlds, end quote. The first world is about the use-value dimension of the real, the material, and the concrete. The second world is about the value and monetary dimension of the ideal, the social, the abstract. The risk is fully actualized in Heinrich, where the process of abstraction is inevitably conceived in a nominalist way. Bachhaus and Reichhelt object that it is impossible to regard value as a real universal along this path, as Marx did. The peculiar, quote, objectivity, end quote, that is at issue in Marx, not in Heinrich, is a universal which is at the same time sensible. In their argument, the movement of thought characterized by them as the absolute value, here the authors should write, in my view, quote, intrinsic value, end quote, presents itself as an interior which is externalized, as an exchange value. Here the authors are talking of, quote, absolute value, end quote, properly speaking. Discarding the terminological confusion, I think that the notion of absolute value is what Bachhaus and Reichhelt are trying to deliver. In Heinrich's 1999 second edition, Marx's absolute value in Marx's theories of surplus value is not really discussed, only Riccardo's according to Marx, nor does Heinrich enter into any detailed consideration of Marx's critique of Bailey. Heinrich just affirms that the exposition of the value form in the first chapter of the first edition is dialectically more precise than in Contribution of 1859, primarily because of Marx's confrontation with Bailey's critique of Riccardo. Heinrich maintains that the value objectivity of commodities can only exist in their value relation, acquiring social form and exchange value. In Wie das Marxische Kapital lesen, Leitung und Kommentar zum Anfang des Kapital, Teil 2, Heinrich 2021 writes that for Marx, while value was initially only one of the two factors of the commodity, it acquires an autonomous shape, selbstständige Gestalt, in money as money. All this is correct, but only if it goes hand in hand with the inner-outer movement, the movement of, quote, expression, end quote, and the understanding that for Marx, the essential role of money as a commodity allows the quantitative anticipated existence of value before exchange, embodied value as a notional expected magnitude. However, this side of Marx is strongly turned down by Heinrich, and if recognized, it is theoretically rejected. Backhaus supervised Helmut Brentel's PhD dissertation in Frankfurt, which was delivered in 1984 and then revised and updated to become Brentel 1989. Contrary to Diethard Behrens and Cornelia Hafner, who defined Brentel as, quote, an unusual reading to say the least, end quote, I find Chapter 3, A soziale Form und Ökonomisches Objekt to be one of the most accurate investigations about Marx's critique of Bailey, to which I cannot do justice here. I limit myself to remind that rightly Brentel, quoting Marx about the absolutes, Verhältnis, the absolute relation, claims that in Marx, the attribution of the absolute and the relative are reversed. What Bailey takes as the metaphysically, quote, absolute value, end quote, of commodities turns out to be a relative relation of the commodity output to the labor of society as a whole. It is the, quote, absolute, end quote, expression of its, quote, relative value, end quote. Value is expressed as something relative, but now in the absolute relation by which it is value. It is the competitively enforced totality of private labors and their relation to one another. What is, quote, absolute, end quote, is this specific determination of commodities through labor, not the concrete computability of individual values. One second, where am I? Like Coletti and Napoleoni, as well as Rubin, Brentel maintains that the individual commodities does have in advance a, quote, imminent, end quote, value. Abstract labor depends on circulation, but not as a phase distinct from production, only as the totality of the circle production circulation where commodities are produced for the market. Abstract labor is latent, but as such already exists in immediate production. Indeed, for Brental, abstract universal labor is an anticipatory concept of the totality of the socialization of labor under universalized capitalist commodity production. The economic form is always a thingly and reified form. Because value as a social relation can only be expressed in a material, that is, in a gold matter as something, quote, volumetric, end quote. This sensible character of the economic form is the basis of its generally, quote, valid, end quote, character as a thought form about what people must reckon with and how they must act in the economic intercourse. And this is an echo both of Bauhaus and Reichelt. Lars Meyer, in his Absoluter Wert und Allgemeiner Wille, Absolute Value and General Will, also moves from a conceptual landscape very near to Bauhaus and Reichelt. Quote, absolute value, end quote, is even inscribed in the title. An enlightening theme chased by this author is that in dialectical social theory, the universal is not imagined as a substance, end quote, but as the constant mediation of the unity of society, made abstract and autonomous through the singular and the particular, something which very much resembles what Marx was doing in theories of surplus value and beyond. Before concluding this summary review of the reception of, quote, absolute value, I cannot avoid mentioning Chris Arthur's 2022 book, though it is neither an interpretation of Marx strictly speaking nor a comment on Bailey. It is, however, useful to look at how the same concept emerges in Arthur's personal line of reasoning. In a perspective where labor is not the, quote, substance, end quote, of value, Arthur's absolute value mimics many of Marx's notion characteristics. For Arthur, quote, money as the unique universal equivalent is necessary to the actuality of value, end quote. And, quote, in its own activity, money makes itself necessary by taking on the position of, quote, absolute value, end quote, against commodities, end quote. Quote, absolute, end quote, does not mean, quote, unconditioned, end quote, but that value is presented substantively as independent of exchange value. Footnote. This notion in Arthur indicates a relative exchange ratio, differently from my convention in this chapter where it is a sort of absolute exchange ratio. End footnote. Where am I? Sorry, I might be reading the same sentence again. Quote, absolute does not mean, quote, unconditioned, but that value is presented substantively as independent of exchange value. Arthur asserts that, quote, money is value in absolute form because money exists in seeming autonomy from the commodity relations originally supposed to be characterized by value. Determined as, quote, absolute, end quote, it simply exhibits itself as what it is, end quote. Arthur. In my view, the autonomy of absolute value cannot be reduced simply to a, quote, semblance, end quote, as Arthur's formulation may induce to think. That autonomy springs from those commodity relations themselves. Last but not least, the, quote, embodiment, end quote, of intrinsic value as the ghostly objectivity of latent abstract labor. In money, as a commodity, as absolute value, the point I underlined in my interpretation of Marx is nowhere to be found in Arthur. Footnote. I very much agree with Arthur's argument that the, quote, unity, end quote, of commodities and labor is not categorically justified in Marx in the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, and whatever addition in an adequate way. Yet even if I am convinced that the total labor as the social unity behind the world of commodities is not justified in the early chapters, and provide an alternative ground in the conclusion, I refrain from Arthur's bold move of completely severing the link between value and labor at the opening of Marx's theoretical discourse in Capital. As I have argued in the past, the expository structure of the 3 volumes of Capital is such that it begins with seemingly subjective, quote, for us, end quote, abstractions. They must be brought about, objectively, going beyond a merely mental abstraction and achieving a real abstraction. This is what Marx accomplishes with his account, since Chapter 7 of Volume 1, of the constitution of capital, thanks to his method of comparison with his conceptualization of the practical abstraction of wage labor. End footnote. The interpreter, probably more than anyone else, came near to Marx's argument on absolute value, at the same time problematizing it rather than taking it for granted, is Penavaja, 1976, in her introduction and editorial apparatus to her translation of Marx's analysis about the value form in the first edition of Capital. I'm not really seeing anything. Try to look at Penavaja. Penavaja was, so to speak, at the intersection point of the network connecting the authors I privileged among the interpreters. Penavaja studied with Lucio Coletti and Claudio Napoleoni in Rome in the late 1960s. In the early 1970s, after attending the Department of Social Sciences at the Goethe Universität in Frankfurt am Main, Penavaja obtained a doctorate in economics and social sciences at the University of Bremen under Helmut Reichheld. In these years, Penavaja was in contact with Hans-Georg Bachhaus. Not that Penavaja's own understanding is without ambiguities, but Penavaja came very near to what I see as a correct interpretation. Human labor's objectification as an abstract object is a, quote, thing of thought, end quote. Ein Gedankending, a, quote, imaginary thing, end quote. Hirngespint. Yet Marx writes, commodities are things. Quote, what they are, they must be materially. That is, they must show it in their material relations. A certain amount of human labor, quote, what they are, they must be materially. That is, they must show it in their material relations. A certain amount of human labor power has been expended. Its value is the purely objective reflection of the labor thus expended in the linen. But this value is not reflected in its own body. It, quote, reveals itself, end quote, Offenbart sich, and takes on a sensible expression through its relation of value to another commodity, the coat. While the linen makes the coat the same with itself as value, and at the same time distinguishes itself from it as a use value, the coat becomes the form of manifestation, Erscheinungsform, of the value of the linen in contrast to the body of the coat. That is, it becomes the, quote, form of value, end quote, of the cloth in contrast to its natural form, end quote. Penavaja. Not only does Penavaja understand the thrust of Marx's reasoning, but she also perceives how shaky is the foundation on which Marx's argument is erected. She rightly claims that the category of labor as the substance of absolute value is not sufficiently explained in its logical historical implications. Instead, it is developed through connotations and other analogical concepts which, although related to the supposed identity between value and the monetary expression of labor, do not properly ground it. She adds convincingly that Marx gives no reason as to why the labor expended to produce a commodity, quote, crystallized or, quote, coagulated in it, is assumed to be the creative substance of value. In truth, I have shown that the reason Marx offers is assuming money as a commodity, that is, a product of labor. But put in this way, Marx's value theory stands or falls with the approach to money as a commodity, as Napoleoni, Backhaus, and Reichelt more or less recognized. I do not find that alleged, quote, foundation, end quote, for Marx's value theory persuasive. The end.